Emerson Brown, a 53-year-old life insurance analyst, had been living what many would consider a successful and fulfilling life. He was a devoted husband to Alicia Brown, a woman he had been married to for 20 years, and the father of 2 children. They had spent the past 2 decades building a family and a future together, marking their personal and professional achievements with quiet pride. On this particular summer day in June 2000, the couple boarded the Voyager of the Seas cruise ship, setting sail from the port of Miami for a celebratory vacation, one meant to commemorate their 2-decade-long marriage. It was to be an escape from the routine, a time for romance, adventure, and relaxation, far from the demands of their everyday lives. Emerson was a man whose life was shaped by balance, steady, methodical, and ever so dependable. His colleagues at the insurance firm admired him for his keen mind and unwavering dedication to his work, though some of them secretly envied the stability that seemed to come so naturally to him. His professional life was anchored in the details, the fine print of policies, the careful analysis of risks and claims. It was a world of precision and calculation, where success came from knowing what to expect. But when it came to his personal life, things weren't as predictable as they seemed. Alicia, his wife, was the loving, sometimes overly protective partner. She adored her husband, but there were signs that their relationship was not without its complexities. Behind their smiles and social appearances, there were murmurs of discontent, a subtle disconnect that perhaps only those closest to them noticed. Alicia had always been the more outgoing of the two, the more emotionally expressive, while Emerson was more reserved, a man who kept his inner turmoil tightly bound, never fully sharing the weight of his burdens with anyone. The decision to take a cruise, to escape the pressures of their lives for a week of sun, sea, and relaxation, seemed to be an attempt to rekindle their romance, a last-ditch effort to restore some of the magic that had faded over the years. But what should have been a tranquil celebration of their shared past soon turned into a nightmare. The Voyager of the Seas was a massive floating resort, a marvel of luxury and engineering, with every possible amenity one could imagine. The ship, with its pristine decks and glittering pools, was filled with hundreds of passengers seeking the same type of reprieve that Emerson and Alicia were. But for Emerson, the voyage began to feel more like a form of exile than a vacation. There was a sense of unease that seemed to follow him, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. This wasn't an unusual sensation for Emerson, who often found himself analyzing situations and people with the same scrutiny he applied to his work. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that, despite the grandiosity of their surroundings, something within his marriage, and perhaps even within himself, was shifting. On the evening of June 14, 2000, just a day before the tragedy would strike, Emerson and Alicia attended a formal dinner on board the ship. The night was filled with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses as couples and families dined together, oblivious to the storm that was brewing in the shadows. It was during this dinner that Alicia noticed her husband's unusual mood. He was quieter than usual, lost in thought, and despite the festive atmosphere, Emerson's mind seemed miles away. Alicia brushed off her concerns, attributing his behavior to the stress of their work or perhaps the unfamiliarity of their surroundings. But it was not just the ambience of the cruise that troubled Emerson, it was his own inner turmoil. For months, he had been wrestling with thoughts of a deeper, more personal issue, something that he had kept hidden from everyone, even from Alicia. Emerson had been having an affair. It wasn't something he was proud of, nor was it a decision he made lightly. But the affair was real, and it had been going on for several months. His lover, Robinson Stewart, was a colleague from his insurance company, a charming and ambitious man who seemed to offer the emotional connection that Emerson had begun to feel was missing from his marriage. Despite his guilt and his efforts to rationalize his actions, Emerson knew that he had to make a choice soon, either end the affair or leave Alicia. But there was another complication. Emerson's feelings for Stewart were not entirely uncomplicated. There was a deep sense of jealousy and frustration tied to the relationship. Emerson had realized that Stewart was no longer content with the position he had in Emerson's life. Stewart had become possessive, demanding, and more insistent about his role in Emerson's future. Emerson had already made the decision to end the affair, but the timing of that decision was key, especially considering the increasingly volatile nature of Stewart's emotions. And then there was John McLean, a quiet and reserved librarian Emerson had met on a work trip several months earlier. They had struck up an unexpected friendship, and in a way, Emerson had confided in John in a way he hadn't with anyone else. John's presence provided Emerson with a sense of peace and calm, yet there was something more to their relationship that Emerson couldn't quite understand. Whether it was a deep emotional bond or just an escape from his complicated life, Emerson knew that his connection with John was something that had to remain secret, complicated, entangled in layers of affection and confusion. As the evening progressed, Emerson excused himself from the dinner table, citing a headache. He walked slowly back to their cabin, the cool night air brushing against his face, carrying with it the salty scent of the sea. He told Alicia he would retire early, needing rest for the busy day they had planned for tomorrow. Alicia, somewhat relieved to have some peace and quiet after their tense dinner, agreed to let him be, unknowingly leaving him to wrestle with his thoughts. But that night, Emerson's mind was far from restful. Alone in the cabin, he couldn't escape the conflicting emotions that swirled inside him, the guilt over his infidelity, the impending decision to end things with Stewart, and the ever-growing sense that he was losing control of his own life. And just like that, without warning, the undercurrents of tension and unresolved emotion would set in motion a series of events that would end in tragedy. The next morning, the calm of the sea was shattered by a discovery that would forever change the lives of those on board the Voyager of the Seas. At around 8 a.m., a fishing boat operating off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico found the lifeless body of Emerson Brown floating in the water. The news spread quickly, and the ship's crew and passengers were immediately thrown into a state of confusion and fear. The case would soon become a chilling mystery, one that would unravel not only the dark secrets of Emerson's life but also the deep and dangerous currents of passion, jealousy, and betrayal that had led to his untimely death. The morning of June 15, 2000, began like any other day on board the Voyager of the Seas. The passengers were slowly waking up to the promise of another day at sea, with sunlight streaming through the thick glass windows of the ship's observation decks. The gentle rocking of the ship and the soft hum of the engine provided a soothing backdrop to what was, for most, a carefree cruise. But that serene atmosphere would be shattered before 8 a.m. A fishing boat, operated by a local fisherman from a nearby port, was making its rounds in the Gulf of Mexico. As they cast their nets into the water, the crew made a horrifying discovery: a body, floating lifelessly in the water. The body was quickly pulled aboard, and the crew noticed that it was wearing a dark-colored shirt and khaki shorts, not typical attire for someone out on the water. It was Emerson Brown, or at least, it appeared to be. The fisherman immediately alerted the Coast Guard, who confirmed that the body belonged to a male passenger from the Voyager of the Seas. The ship's crew, still unaware of what had transpired, was informed within minutes. Within an hour, the news reached Alicia Brown, who had just stepped out to enjoy a quiet breakfast on the deck. At first, she was in a state of disbelief. Emerson, her husband of 20 years, had been found dead, his body adrift in the water. How could this be? How could someone so full of life end up in such a way? Panic, confusion, and a sense of dread began to settle over the ship as the captain issued an immediate announcement over the loudspeakers. Passengers were told to remain in their cabins as the authorities began an investigation into Emerson's death. The news quickly spread through the ranks of the ship's officers. The ship's security personnel, along with medical staff, immediately began to piece together the details. Emerson had been found miles away from the ship's scheduled route, which raised the first of many troubling questions. Had he fallen overboard? Had he been pushed? Was it an accident, or something more sinister? The FBI was called in to investigate, given the mysterious circumstances and the fact that Emerson's body had been found in the water rather than in his cabin. As the ship was still in international waters, the FBI took jurisdiction over the case, sending agents to the ship to lead the investigation. The ship, which had been a symbol of relaxation and escape just hours before, had now become a crime scene. As the investigation began, the detectives started by examining the ship's interior, beginning with Emerson's cabin. The room where Emerson had spent his final hours was disturbingly disordered. The bed was unmade, and pieces of furniture had been overturned. There were shards of glass on the floor, suggesting a struggle of some sort. It was clear that Emerson had not simply slipped over the balcony in an accidental fall. No, this was something far more violent. A sense of foreboding hung in the air as the investigators collected evidence. They noted the balcony door was ajar, indicating that someone, or something, had gone through it. The cabin had a small outdoor balcony where Emerson and Alicia had likely spent time enjoying the view. But now, it looked as if the space had been disturbed, like a scene from a struggle. The furniture was out of place, and there were marks on the railing, something that would prove vital to the investigation later. Alicia was immediately questioned. Her reaction to the news of her husband's death was a mixture of grief and shock. But as she spoke with the investigators, something about her behavior didn't sit right. There was a coldness to her demeanor, an almost robotic calmness that made the detectives uneasy. Of course, in moments of trauma, people react differently, and Alicia could simply be in shock. But the detectives couldn't help but wonder whether there was more to her calm exterior. She told them that she hadn't seen Emerson since late the previous evening when he had excused himself early from their dinner. It was then that the first real lead emerged. Alicia had made one critical admission: Emerson had not been alone during the cruise. He had been seeing someone outside their marriage. Alicia spoke of it briefly, almost dismissively, suggesting that it wasn't the main focus of the investigation, but it certainly piqued the detectives' interest. The revelation of an affair was nothing new in investigations like this, but it hinted at potential motives. It wasn't just a marriage falling apart. Emerson had been involved with two people, not just one. One of these relationships was with Robinson Stewart, a colleague from his insurance firm. The other, more secretive, was with John McLean, a librarian who had become a close friend of Emerson's during a work trip. Both men were brought in for questioning. The detectives began with Robinson Stewart, a man in his early 40s, with striking looks and a charming personality. Robinson had been a longtime colleague of Emerson's, and their working relationship had evolved into something much more personal. Stewart, like Emerson, was married, but his marriage had its own issues. However, unlike Emerson, Stewart seemed to wear his emotions on his sleeve. He was openly possessive of Emerson, and it wasn't long before the detectives learned that he had become frustrated with Emerson's decision to end their affair. It was a bitter pill for Stewart to swallow. Emerson had made it clear to Stewart that he was moving on from their relationship, a fact that did not sit well with his lover. The finality of it all seemed to have triggered a violent reaction in Robinson. But Robinson denied any involvement in Emerson's death. He claimed that they had not seen each other in days, and that he was unaware of any pending confrontation. His story was consistent, yet the investigators had their doubts. Robinson's emotions were raw when speaking of Emerson, grief mixed with anger and jealousy, and that made him a person of interest. What had begun as a subtle suspicion now began to grow. The detectives started looking into Stewart's movements during the night Emerson died, but they didn't have enough to connect him directly to the crime. Meanwhile, John McClane's name also surfaced in the investigation. The quiet, introspective librarian seemed to be the complete opposite of Robinson, calm, collected, and even a bit distant. But the detectives' interviews with him revealed a different side. John had become emotionally close to Emerson during their work trip, and their relationship had grown to something more intimate, although neither man openly acknowledged the true nature of their bond. For McClane, Emerson was a source of comfort and escape from his own complex life, and he seemed deeply hurt by the sudden coldness Emerson had shown toward him in recent weeks. Yet, despite the emotional complications of both relationships, the detectives were still far from solving the case. No one had a clear motive, and the lack of definitive evidence made it difficult to pin down the killer. But the investigation was just beginning, and as the search for answers intensified, it became clear that the truth would not be easily uncovered. The story of Emerson's death was not just about a tragic accident. It was about the complexities of human relationships, the secrets that people kept hidden beneath the surface, and the devastating impact of betrayal and jealousy. It was clear that someone on board that ship had known Emerson's secrets, and someone was willing to kill to keep them from being exposed. As the investigators dug deeper, they realized that the crime might not have been the result of a single individual's anger, but rather a tangled web of emotions, betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately, murder. As the investigation into Emerson Brown's death continued, the case took on an increasingly complicated dimension. The FBI agents on board Voyager of the Seas knew that the body floating in the Gulf of Mexico was not just the result of an accident or a simple case of foul play. There was a web of emotions, secrets, and betrayals at the heart of this tragedy, and they were determined to uncover the truth. The first major breakthrough came when the investigators uncovered a crucial piece of evidence that hadn't been noticed during their initial sweep of Emerson's cabin. The detectives had discovered a small fragment of fabric, blue in color, caught on one of the metal railings of the balcony. At first glance, it appeared insignificant, a scrap of cloth from someone's clothing. But when they sent the sample to the ship's forensic lab, the results came back with a shocking revelation: the fabric contained traces of Robinson Stewart's DNA. This discovery sent ripples through the investigation. The DNA evidence directly linked Robinson to the crime scene, a significant development in the case. The fragment of fabric had likely come from his shirt or jacket, and its presence on the balcony, where Emerson had fallen, or been pushed, was too much to ignore. The piece of fabric suggested a struggle, a desperate attempt to hold on to something as Emerson was either dragged or forced to the edge of the railing. The detectives immediately brought Robinson Stewart back in for questioning. This time, however, they were more focused. The nature of his relationship with Emerson was no longer just a background detail, it was at the forefront of the investigation. Robinson, as the first prime suspect, would have to explain how his DNA ended up at the crime scene. Robinson's interrogation revealed more than he intended. He had been genuinely upset when Emerson had told him that their affair was over. The emotional bond between them had been intense, and for Robinson, the revelation that Emerson was ending the relationship had hit him hard. He admitted to the detectives that he had been angry, but he denied any involvement in Emerson's death. According to Robinson, he had been in his cabin the entire night, watching television, and hadn't left until the following morning. However, he had no alibi to support his claim. The investigators found Robinson's story suspicious. While there was no direct evidence connecting him to Emerson's death, the discovery of his DNA on the balcony combined with his emotional volatility made him a key figure in the investigation. Still, the detectives knew that they needed more than circumstantial evidence to charge Robinson. They needed a motive, something concrete to tie him to the crime. Meanwhile, the investigation into the other man involved in Emerson's life, John McClane, also gained momentum. John was a quiet, unassuming librarian who had become close to Emerson over the past year. While their relationship had never crossed the boundaries of friendship, the detectives could sense a growing intensity between the two men. John had been one of the few people who had known about Emerson's emotional turmoil and his troubled marriage. In fact, John had confided in the investigators that Emerson had seemed distant in the days leading up to his death. They had spoken on the phone just a few days earlier, and Emerson had seemed torn, unsure of what to do about his marriage and his feelings for Robinson. John was initially a more passive figure in the investigation, but as the detectives dug deeper into his background, they began to uncover something unsettling. John had been in the area when Emerson's body was found. While his movements hadn't been directly observed by anyone, it was soon revealed that he had been on the same deck as Emerson the night before his death. While John's presence didn't necessarily mean he was involved, it raised more questions about the nature of his relationship with Emerson. Had John known about the affair with Robinson? Had he been hurt by Emerson's emotional distance in the days leading up to the tragedy? The detectives began to wonder if jealousy might have played a role in John's behavior. After all, John had been deeply invested in Emerson's life. He may have been aware of the tension between Emerson and Robinson and could have been driven by the desire to remove a rival from his life. Yet, unlike Robinson, John was calm and methodical in his responses. His demeanor during questioning was far more composed, and it was difficult for the investigators to tell whether he was hiding something or simply a man caught in the middle of a tragic love triangle. As the investigation unfolded, a deeper picture of Emerson's relationships began to emerge, relationships that were more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Emerson had been a man pulled in multiple directions, each of his lovers demanding more of him than he was willing or able to give. Robinson, with his volatile emotions and possessiveness, had grown more desperate as Emerson tried to pull away. John, on the other hand, had been the steady anchor Emerson could turn to in moments of doubt, but perhaps that steady calm had masked something darker beneath the surface. Had John been quietly envious of Robinson? Or had he been afraid of losing Emerson's friendship, which had, in its own way, become more than just platonic? It was clear that Emerson had been leading a life full of secrets. But as the investigation moved forward, the detectives began to focus on one critical question: who had the most to gain from his death? Who stood to benefit from the elimination of Emerson Brown? The breakthrough came when a detailed analysis of the ship's surveillance footage revealed a startling piece of evidence. Around the time of Emerson's death, a figure was seen leaving the vicinity of the balcony where Emerson's body was found. The footage was grainy, but the figure appeared to match Robinson Stewart's build. What's more, he was seen walking with an odd urgency, as if he had been in a hurry to leave the scene. It was this footage that solidified the investigation's focus on Robinson. But what had truly happened on the night Emerson died? The investigators had to piece together the final moments of Emerson's life, and in doing so, they discovered something chilling. Emerson had likely been caught in a final confrontation between the two men: Robinson, the man he was trying to end things with, and John, the friend he had once trusted. The web of emotions, lies, and secrets was finally starting to reveal itself, and the truth, as painful as it was, would soon be uncovered. One thing was clear: Emerson had paid the ultimate price for his hidden desires and for the emotional entanglements he had kept buried. As the Voyager of the Seas continued its journey toward its final port of call, the investigation into Emerson Brown's tragic death had become the center of attention on board. With the FBI agents firmly entrenched in their inquiry, each new discovery brought the case closer to its conclusion. The deeper they dug, the more the case began to take shape: two men, one tragic love triangle, and a deadly confrontation that had ended in murder. The surveillance footage had been the breakthrough the investigators needed. Though the video was grainy and difficult to make out, the figure who was seen leaving the balcony shortly before Emerson's body was discovered was unmistakably Robinson Stewart. The footage, combined with the discovery of his DNA on the balcony, had created an unshakable connection between him and the crime scene. However, the question that remained was, why had Robinson Stewart, a man clearly devastated by the end of the affair, resorted to such extreme measures? What had pushed him to kill Emerson? The FBI's investigators continued to piece together the final hours leading up to Emerson's death. According to the testimonies of both Robinson and John McClane, Emerson had been struggling emotionally in the days before his death. It was clear that the pressures of his two secret relationships had become overwhelming. Emerson had told both men that he was planning to leave the affair with Robinson behind, and he had hinted that his marriage to Alicia was coming to an end as well. Robinson's jealousy and anger were palpable, and it was clear that Emerson's intention to cut ties with him had triggered something dark in Robinson. The detectives dug further into Robinson's background and discovered that, beyond his charming exterior, he had a history of volatile behavior. His relationships had often been characterized by possessiveness and outbursts of rage. Robinson had always been unable to cope with rejection, and his inability to accept that Emerson was pulling away had led to violent confrontations in the past. But murder? The investigators now believed it was the result of a final, violent confrontation between Robinson and Emerson, one that had spiraled out of control. It was a Tuesday evening when the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. During a re-interview with Alicia, the detectives uncovered something chilling. Alicia, though initially cooperative, had been hiding something important. When the officers pressed her on the night Emerson died, she hesitated before revealing a detail she had kept to herself. Emerson had planned to confront Robinson during the cruise. Alicia, already suspicious of the affair, had overheard an argument between Emerson and Robinson earlier that evening, an argument that had become heated and emotional. Emerson had told Alicia that he was going to end things for good, and he was afraid that Robinson might not take the breakup well. Alicia's admission was significant. It now seemed that the confrontation between Emerson and Robinson was not an isolated incident but the culmination of a series of unresolved emotions. Robinson had felt humiliated and betrayed, and when Emerson had rejected him one final time, it seemed to have pushed Robinson over the edge. What followed was a violent altercation on the balcony, where Emerson had been forcefully pushed over the edge by Robinson. The struggle and the broken furniture in the cabin, combined with the DNA evidence, all pointed to a brutal act of jealousy and anger. But just as the detectives were preparing to make their move, a surprising turn of events occurred. John McClane, whose involvement had initially seemed minimal, suddenly became a more significant figure in the investigation. McClane had appeared calm and composed throughout his interviews, but something in his demeanor had begun to raise suspicion. When questioned again, John revealed a shocking admission: he had known about Robinson's emotional instability and had even warned Emerson about it. He had also known that Emerson planned to confront Robinson that night. However, it wasn't until the detectives revisited the footage of the ship's cameras that a startling revelation was made. John had been seen on the ship's lower deck around the time Emerson was pushed to his death, seemingly walking toward the area where Emerson's body was discovered. At first, it seemed like John might have been involved in the crime, but further investigation uncovered a much more tragic and complex scenario. John, it turned out, had been in a state of deep emotional turmoil as well. He had been secretly in love with Emerson and had harbored feelings for him that had never been returned. John had been in constant emotional conflict, unable to fully acknowledge his feelings, even to himself. But when he realized that Emerson was planning to leave both his wife and Robinson, and potentially start a new life with someone else, perhaps even with John himself, the situation became unbearable. However, despite John's emotional involvement, the investigation revealed that he was not directly responsible for Emerson's death. While he may have been present in the area, there was no concrete evidence linking him to the actual moment of Emerson's death. His feelings of betrayal and heartbreak were undeniable, but he had not acted on them in the way that Robinson had. Instead, John's role in the investigation was more indirect. After Emerson's death, he had kept quiet about certain details, protecting Robinson to some extent, possibly out of his own grief and confusion. He had been trying to process his own emotions, but ultimately, he did not intervene or prevent Robinson from carrying out the crime. His actions, or rather, his inaction, had allowed Robinson's plan to unfold, but John was not directly complicit in the murder. With all the evidence pointing to Robinson Stewart, the FBI arrested him on the morning of June 17, 2000, as the Voyager of the Seas docked in Miami. Robinson was charged with the murder of Emerson Brown, and the case quickly attracted national attention. The trial that followed was filled with tension, as Robinson's defense team argued that the death had been a tragic accident, a fall that had occurred during a struggle. However, the prosecution countered with the overwhelming evidence of Robinson's motive, his violent history, and the DNA found at the crime scene. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict. Robinson Stewart was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The tragedy of Emerson Brown's death left a permanent scar on those who had known him, his wife, Alicia, who struggled with the betrayal and loss, his children, who were left to grow up without their father, and the friends and colleagues who had once admired him. In the end, the case served as a chilling reminder of the destructive power of jealousy, betrayal, and the complex emotions that can drive people to commit unthinkable acts. The love triangle that had unfolded on the Voyager of the Seas was not just a tale of romance gone wrong, it was a story of human frailty, heartbreak, and the consequences of keeping secrets too long. As the investigation concluded, those who were left behind began the long process of healing, each grappling with their own version of the truth. Alicia, though devastated, found a way to move forward, while John McClane withdrew from public life, never fully recovering from the emotional toll of the events. The Voyager of the Seas would continue its voyages, but for those involved in the tragedy, the journey was forever changed.